The AFL has a long and rich history of over 100 years. Australian rules football stirs every emotion in us all. It's a game that produces special moments every year, both individually and as a team. They are moments that will live forever. Here are 45 of the AFL's most memorable moments. The 1970 VFL Grand Final had it all. In front of a record crowd of 121,696, football's greatest rivals, Carlton and Collingwood, played out a match for the ages. There would be the goal-kicking genius of Peter McKenna, whose 5 first-half goals enabled the Magpies to lead by 44 points at half-time. And in a frenetic second half, the master coach Ron Barassi issued his immortal orders to handball at every opportunity and run the Pies off their feet.
We did increase our handball rate, and we did more from the back line because we had to take risk. I mean, when you're down, you've got to do risks.
Carlton would respond through an unlikely hero in 19th man Ted Hopkins. His 4 goals helped the Blues to a famous and barnstorming victory by 10 points. It would be Barassi and Collingwood again in 1977, and another of those heart-wrenching finales. The grand final between Barassi's Kangaroos and Tom Hafey's Magpies had seen Collingwood sparkle, and at the end of the last change, they led by 27 points. A 5-goal final quarter, however, saw North Melbourne hit the front. Enter Ross Dunn. He would goal from this pack mark, and when the siren sounded, the VFL had produced only the second grand final draw in 80 years. A week later in the replay, there would be more magic moments, none more so than the run of Phil Manasseh. And he's put it through! A second flag for the Kangaroos, and for the Magpies, more heartache. In the third of our memorable grand finals of the 70s, Supercoach Ron Barassi would again be the pivotal figure. After losing to Richmond in 1974, Barassi's Roos, under former Essendon great Barry Davis, would face Hawthorn for the 75 premiership. The Roos had explosive players of the calibre of Croswell and Kekovich, veterans in Rantel, Davis, Cable and Wade, and rising superstars in Dench, Gregg and Schimmelbusch. In 1975, after 50 years as lowly battlers, they would easily defeat Hawthorn, ending their reign as the only VFL club to have not won the premiership. The Roos by a kick, Blight cheered from the ground by ecstatic and disbelieving teammates, and a mighty reputation for the freakish and unpredictable was forged. It remains the most contentious of umpiring decisions decades later, but for sheer determination, the effort of Wayne Harmes in the 1979 Grand Final stands with the very best. Carlton had a slender last quarter lead over Collingwood when the ball slithered towards the boundary line. Harmes sized up the situation superbly, threw himself at the football and managed to knock it back to his teammate Ken Sheldon.
Whilst I, not for 1 minute, knew that he was going to punch that ball back from the boundary line, whether it be in or out the play, didn't really matter, but I just thought that there was a chance, and if he was going to do the work, then I was going to do my part to be there as well, and that's part of team footy, I guess. That's how you win premierships.
While the Magpie faithful claimed the ball was out of bounds, Sheldon Gold gave Carlton breathing space, and the Blues would go on and win the flag by a kick. For Wayne Harmes, the unlikely hero, he would be remembered for that selfless courage and be rewarded with the first Norm Smith medal as best of field in the biggest match of all.
Well, I get asked, as you might imagine, 1 million times over the years, and I always answer back with a question. I say, I ask the person, well, who do you barrack for? And probably 90 times out of 100, they say Collingwood. And I say, well, yeah, well, it was probably dubious whether it was in or out, I'm not sure.
The 1964 Grand Final between Melbourne and Collingwood would produce not one but 2 freakish moments in one of the most dramatic final quarters in league history. The first would come from the Magpies' bear-like skipper Ray Gablick. He snatched the ball on the half-forward flank and steamed towards goal. Bouncing the ball erratically and moving like a runaway train, Big Gabbo was in the clear, and the relief was obvious as he goaled to put his Pies in front. Elation turned to despair just minutes later at the other end. The ball was cleared, fell into the arms of Melbourne's back pocket player Neil Crompton, who would kick his only goal for the year. That snap gave the Demons a 4-point win, their 6th premiership under Norm Smith, and would be the defining moment in Crompton's 99-game VFL career. It'll be remembered as the shootout. Geelong and Essendon at the MCG on a Saturday afternoon in 1993. Gary Ablett at one end, Paul Salmon at the other, and a crowd of almost 47,000 transfixed as these two great sharpshooters traded goal for goal. Ablett might well have broken every scoring record that afternoon, but had to be content with 14 goals, 7 behinds from 25 kicks. Salmon's hamstring gave way after he'd booted 10.
It was a day for forwards, and I look back and say, what a great game to be a part of, and a part of the bigger picture, I suppose.
Essendon would win the game by 4 goals, and Ablett would leave the ground having scored more goals in a losing side than any man in history.
One of the great performances in AFL history.
Nearly 60 years after the last of his 104 games with Melbourne, Fred Fanning holds 2 unique goal-kicking records. His 97 goals in 1947 remains the best in a season by a Demon, but it was his solo effort against St Kilda in his final game at the Junction Oval that year which has never been bettered. 3 times the VFL goal-kicking champ, Fanning accepted a massive offer to coach Hamilton. So at the age of 25, he left the Demons on the highest possible note, with a performance for the ages. With his matinee idol looks and freakish ability, Essendon's John Coleman was the superstar of his time, and arguably the greatest full forward we've seen. Although reticent to join the Bombers, Coleman made his debut against Hawthorn at Windy Hill in the opening game of 1949 and kicked 12. The legend was born.
He was just awesome that day, and he kicked 12, and he just continued his career on and just starred pretty well every game.
That year he'd kick 100, and in the years ahead, crowds would follow him quarter by quarter from one end of the ground to the other. He would play only 98 games, but was the VFL's leading goal kicker 4 times. From that fabulous debut through to the knee injury which ended his career in 1954, Coleman was the game's greatest draw card. He would be an inaugural AFL legend, named as full forward in the AFL Team of the Century, and the league's goal-kicking champion each year is honoured with the Coleman Medal. It was a painful birth plagued by ticketing and turf problems, but if there was one talking point in the season 2000, it was the state-of-the-art stadium at the Docklands. Colonial Stadium, as it was christened, hosted its first game in round 1, making history as Essendon and Port Adelaide played indoors under a retractable roof at the $460 million venue. The crowd of 43,000 had a mixed reaction. Michael Long kicked the first goal, Matthew Lloyd kicked 7 more, and the Bombers trounced the Power by 94 points.
It was the year 2000, we had a great team. The guys were pretty excited, and really the crowd had come to it was Colonial Stadium back then for the first time, and it was a pretty memorable night for the Essendon Footy Club. We had a huge win, and I think the crowd got pretty carried away.
The stadium's reputation would be savaged in the months ahead before the grass settled and the public warmed to their world-class stadium. This is the only known moving vision of football's great champion of the 30s, Fitzroy's Hayden Bunton. He won Brownlow medals in his first 2 seasons, and in 1935 became the first of 4 men to win it 3 times. While the medal count was held at VFL headquarters and had none of the fanfare of today's extravaganzas, Bunton's win was a celebration of the best footballer in the land. He played only 119 games, but that was enough to earn him a place as a rover in the AFL Team of the Century and legend status in the Hall of Fame. In 1938, he moved to Western Australia and won the Sandover Medal 3 times in 4 years. Edward Goodrich Greaves was the first footballer to win the Charles Brownlow Medal as the fairest and best player in the VFL. Nicknamed Karji, some say after Karjillo, the Rajah of Bong, a travelling magician, Greaves was just adept at sleight of hand or foot. He was just 20, and in his second year with Geelong, he won the inaugural medal in 1924, and in the years ahead, he would finish second on another 3 occasions. Sadly, there is little footage of Greaves in action, some newsreel footage of the 1931 Grand Final win over Geelong is all that remains. The brilliant sentiment in the number 20 jumper, who would win football's highest individual honour after just 25 games. Collingwood and Richmond on Grand Final Day 1929. The Pies going for the third of their famous quartet of premierships, and at full forward they had a standout. Gordon Richard James Coventry, or just plain nuts to family and friends, had not only become the first league footballer to kick 100 goals that season, but he'd finished with 124. Coventry was the great record breaker. By the time he retired in 1937, he'd played more games and kicked more goals than any other player in the 40-year history of the league. Few thought Gordon Coventry's records would be bettered. It took 62 years for that almost mythical mark of 1,299 career goals to be equalled and then overtaken. Tony Lockett was more suited to the rustic family life, but the boy from Ballarat would emerge as the greatest goal kicker of them all. In 1999, he lined up for goal number 1,300 against Collingwood at the Sydney Cricket Ground. The kick was a shocker. As he said later, terrible, but good enough.
I gave the players a bit of a spray at half-time, which included Tony. I must admit I never gave Tony one, and I spoke to him about, in front of the group, that he kicked his record had he put the cue in the rack. So Tony could tell had steam coming out of his ears, and then he proceeded to end up with 9 goals. He ended up dominating the second half.
Lockett would retire, make a lukewarm comeback 3 years later before leaving the new goal-kicking mark at 1,360 goals. It's one of the great tragedies of football that the soaring and majestic marks of Bob Pratt were not caught for posterity on film. Pratt was the acrobatic high flyer, the full forward who soared past Coventry and took his art to new heights. As South Melbourne's Foreign Legion made the mid-30s their own, Pratt was their superstar goal kicker, the man who made the turnstiles a blur. In 1933, he kicked the first of a hat-trick of centuries, but it was in 1934 that he set his mark of 150 goals, a mark that was equalled by Peter Hudson in 1971, but has never been bettered. The crowd of 44,507 who turned up to see reigning premiers West Coast play Essendon on a Sunday in July 1993 was the biggest to witness a home and away match in Melbourne featuring a non-Victorian club, and they were treated to an absolute beauty. There was the aerial display put on by Gavin Wanganeen and the lopsided kicking talents of Paul Salmon. The Big Fish had kicked 7 straight behinds before finding range and target with the match winner in the dying seconds. It was enough to have Kevin Sheedy launch himself from the coach's box and wave his jacket enthusiastically to the crowd. While rival coach Mick Malthouse thought the gesture insulting to his players and was fined for criticising the umpires, Sheedy's gesture would catch on and become a highlight at Eagles-Bombers matches for years to come. Hawthorn looked dead and all but buried as they trailed Essendon in the final term at Windy Hill in round 18, 1982. Enter Lee Matthews. The Hawthorn skipper took about rearranging the scoreboard. He booted a goal and set up another. And if that wasn't enough to fire up the Hawthorn faithful, Lethal Lee set about rearranging the hardware as well. The Hawks recovered from their 19-point deficit, kicked 8 goals 6 to 2 straight goals to record a 3-goal win. And the splintered point post, well, that was sold at auction years later to AFL legend and memorabilia collector Ron Barassi. Their Irish import Jimmy Steins ran across the mark, incurring a 15-metre penalty.
As soon as I darted off the line I was on, I just knew, I just went, oh no. Dad was there, my mum was there. It was the first game of footy they ever saw, you know. Robbie Flair, it was his last game. He played for Melbourne for, 16 years or something, and had never played in the grand final. That was his first final series, So it was, we were first time in 26 years we were in a final alone, and it was just a lot of mixed emotions in that room.
A week later, the Hawks would run out of legs and go down to Carlton by 33 points for the 1987 flag. Red-hot favourites to take out the 1948 premiership, Essendon, under Dick Reynolds, kicked its chances away with one of the most appalling displays of inaccuracy in finals history. The Bombers had beaten Melbourne twice during the season, and with some ease in the second semi-final, and despite the bad kicking, were favoured when they led by 2 goals in the final quarter. The Demons had recalled veteran Jack Mueller, who with Norm Smith provided a potent forward line in a low-scoring match. And for the first time, the VFL Grand Final had ended with scores level. The following week, Mueller and Smith starred again as Melbourne won the flag by 39 points. The solo performance of Gary Ablett was just one of the features that made the 1989 Grand Final between Geelong and Hawthorn a game for the ages. There would be the bone-jarring opening that left Dermot Brereton reaching, the tackles on Di Domenico and Platten, and a ferocity rarely witnessed on this grand stage. As Hawthorn attempted to win back-to-back flags for the first time, the Cats, under Malcolm Blight, had clawed their way back into the game after trailing by 6 goals at the last break. Ablett would provide the heroics. Not only would he kick 9 goals and break the scoring record in a grand final, but he would do so with skill, class and brilliance. Geelong would kick 8 goals in the final term and come within 6 points of a miraculous come-from-behind win against the bruised and battered Hawks. Ablett would be rewarded with the Norm Smith Medal as the best player on the ground for his inspirational performance.
It's the most satisfying grand final to win, going back to a memory, and the reason being is just for the sheer hard work. The best compliment I've ever heard personally to me in footy, above anything else, came from Alan Jean's post-match, and he turned around and said to somebody else, he said, "There's myths and there's legends in footy, but there's no myths about Dermy." And that was the best thing I've ever had said about me.
Just 1 year before television cameras would poke their heads into the world of VFL football, we had to rely on newsreel and newspapers to give us the action shots of the day. In the 1955 Grand Final, Collingwood's champion Des Healy would collide with Melbourne youngster Frank Adams. The photograph of them motionless, one of the most famous of the era. 20th man Adams had come off the bench and sprinted to intercept the Magpie speedster. Healy didn't see him coming, and the sickening collision left both unconscious. Adams was out for 45 minutes. Healy woke up with a fractured skull and his nose broken in 5 places. While Melbourne would go on and record a famous win, Adams would play in 6 premierships. Healy won Collingwood's Copeland Trophy in 1955, retired and then accepted the coaching job at Wodonga. In one of those quirky little moves that Kevin Sheedy delights in, the Bombers made history in round 22 of 1990. The newspapers of the day announced Essendon's 4 Danaher brothers would line up against St Kilda, all in key positions and all together in the one AFL side for the first and only time. There would be fullback Anthony in game 182, dual premiership captain Terry at centre-half forward in game 288, 24-year-old Chris in the centre in game 10, and at full forward, the bloke Sheedy reckons could have been the best of them all, the injury-plagued Neil in his 82nd and final game. The only time 4 siblings had lined up together in 94 years of VFL football produced few surprises. The top side in the competition thumped St Kilda at Moorabbin. St Kilda's victory over Collingwood at Victoria Park in the 4th round of the 1993 season would have a significant encore. Delighted with his side's fighting win but riled by the racial abuse hurled his way from the crowd, St Kilda's Nicky Winmar staged his own one-man demonstration. As this famous photo shows so poignantly, Winmar lifted his red, white and black jumper and pointed to his body. He was black and proud of it. The AFL was trying to get its message across also, the league taking measures to stamp out racial vilification. Winmar's stand getting to the very crux of its campaign. It was a battle of mind over body, a battle of wills that defied medical advice and perhaps common sense. In round 11 2003, Jason McCartney played the game of football he felt he had to play.
I was really just keen first to get out there, make sure we won, but I wanted to play a part. I never wanted to be clapped and cheered onto the ground and not have done something to help us get across the line.
The North Melbourne forward had been horrifically burned in the terrorist attack on the Sari nightclub in Bali, which had left nearly 200 people dead the previous year. With pressure bandages protecting skin grafts, McCartney would make one courageous farewell. Against Richmond at the Docklands, he would receive a hero's welcome, kick a telling goal in the Kangaroos' 3-point win, and then make an emotional departure.
Fairy tales do come true.
As he left the field, he announced that game number 182 would be his last.
I find it fitting now that I'll hang the boots up as of tonight and go out on a great note. Because I'm spent. It's been a tough time, but that's enough for me, mate.
There was barely a dry eye in the stadium.
It was hard and it was painful, but it was well worthwhile in the end.
When Kevin Bartlett began his senior career at Tigerland in 1965, only Dick Reynolds, Jack Dyer and Gordon Coventry had played more than 300 VFL games. In round 19, 1983, Bartlett would run on to the MCG against Collingwood to play game number 400. His longevity at the highest level could be attributed to his incredible fitness and sustained brilliance over 19 seasons. This day against the Magpies, 61,000 saluted the little Tiger, and 3 weeks later they would say farewell as he bowed out after a record 403 games that included 5 premierships. He would be the first member of the VFL 400 Club. For sheer endurance, the record-breaking run of Melbourne's great Irish import Jimmy Stynes is stunning in its magnitude. Dublin Jim would never have heard of Richmond's Skinny Titus, yet the legendary Tiger forward had left a mark of 204 consecutive games, a mark that was thought to be unattainable. In round 9, 1996 against Essendon at the MCG, Stynes overtook Skinny's record, which had stood since 1943. Illness and injury took no toll on Stynes. He just seemed to play on regardless. A broken hand would finally end the streak in 1998 after 244 games.
So much of the game is played in the head, and for me, sometimes I got a real buzz out of going out there with an illness or an injury of some kind, or with the flu or whatever, and going, I'm going to overcome that and try and play well. And I found that often helped me play better. I performed better than normal because I had a motivation to play well.
He'd retire at season's end, an Iron Man who left a reputation to be proud of. There were those who wondered if old Father Time would ever catch up with Hawthorn's Michael Tuck. He was football's running man. He started in 1972 and just kept on running. The harder he ran, the more records tumbled until finally at the end of the 1991 season, he left the game in style, clutching the Premiership Cup. A battler who played 52 games in the reserves, Tuck would pass 200 games in 1981, 300 in 1985 and 400 in 1990. He'd overtake Kevin Bartlett's games record of 403 that year, and when he retired, he'd push the mark out to 426. Of those 426, 39 were in finals, 11 in grand finals, and 7 were premierships. His record is one for the ages. By sheer weight of premierships, the Collingwood sides of Jock McHale that dominated the Roaring Twenties was the best of the best. In 1930, McHale's men succeeded in topping Carlton's mighty record of 3 consecutive premierships. The Magpies went one better when they downed Geelong by 5 goals. Under captain Sid Coventry, Collingwood established a benchmark for grand final success that stands till this day. Losers in 1925 and 26, the Magpies' run of 6 straight grand finals was highlighted by a string of champion players, none of whom stood taller than the Coventrys, Sid and Gordon, and the Colliers, Lita and Harry. There were 11 players who figured in all 4 premierships win under the coaching genius of McHale. They beat Richmond by 2 goals in teeming rain in 27, but then proved far too good for the Tigers the following 2 years before setting their grand final record by beating Geelong in 1930. The frame shot of the victorious 1930 side, set to the number 4, remains one of the icons of the Collingwood Football Club, an image of greatness. Only the foolhardy could have imagined Collingwood keeping hold of its cherished record of 4 straight flags when the Magpies of Fonts Kine met the mighty Melbourne side of Norm Smith in 1958. The Demons were at the height of their power, were in their 5th consecutive grand final, and had been all-conquering throughout the season. When the Sun published the players' numbers, thwarting the exclusivity of the football record, the VFL reacted angrily, instructing both sides to alter their numbers for the game. Melbourne kicked 5 first-quarter goals and a replay of the second semi-final hiding was in the air. But then Collingwood unleashed an aggressive brand of football that left the Demons reeling. By half-time, Collingwood had taken the lead and at the last break led by 33 points. Thorold Merritt was best of field, while Barry Hooker Harrison had blanketed Melbourne's dynamic ruck rover Ron Barassi. The Pies by 3 goals in one of the greatest boil-overs in grand final history, and that 4-in-a-row record remained in black and white hands. It seemed incredible that 2 of the league's great powerhouses, Collingwood and Essendon, would meet in the 1990 grand final, their first premiership showdown since 1911. And what an October showdown this was. The game was marred by the ugliest grand final brawl in decades as Magpie Gavin Brown was knocked unconscious by Bomber veteran Terry Danaher. The all-in brawl saw 13 reports and spurred Collingwood to great heights. While Essendon would kick only 3 goals in the next 3 quarters, Lee Matthews fired his men. They kicked 11, none more telling than Brown's late in the 3rd quarter. This day was Collingwood's, the final margin 48 points. At last the dreaded collywobbles had been laid to rest as the 32-year premiership drought was broken. For best of field and Norm Smith medalist Tony Shaw, the agony of those years was erased as he held the cup aloft.
All I wanted was a cup. I didn't care less about the Norm Smith. Look, it's great now and you probably live on it a bit more, with the Norm Smith, but it's only part of the memory. But I just wanted to hold that cup up because having been through, my brother played in 5 losing ones and I'd played in 2 before then, so we had a bit of a history there. And when I got that cup in my hand, that was just unbelievable.
On football's grand stage, there were none bigger than Mr. Football, E.J. Whitten. Champion player, master showman.
You've got to inspire me with this last quarter bit. You've been in front all day, you've got to stay there.
When his life-threatening illness became public in 1995, the football world prepared for the worst. The AFL responded immediately by naming Whitten as the inaugural legend in their Hall of Fame, despite the fact the Hall of Fame concept was only in its embryonic stage. In June, Whitten would make one last public appearance. Flanked by son Ted Jr., he would do a lap of honour at the home of football prior to the State of Origin match between Victoria and South Australia. Almost blind, EJ made his own farewell, one that would be remembered forever by those 64,000 at the MCG on that grey afternoon. Friends and foes of days past were on hand for the teary finale, and then in August, he was gone. The legend, however, lives on.
And I think I was like probably nearly every person in the ground that day that got fairly emotional about it. And I think we're all so proud to know the guy, but he was suffering. But just to see his courage on that day firsthand was something that I'll never forget.
West Coast. Strip away the glitz and glamour of the 2003 Brownlow Medal count, and you were left with the most heart-wrenching finale to football's night of nights in history. 6 players vying for the medal, and just 1 vote making the difference between glory and heartbreak. In 2003, there would be 3 players locked on 22 votes at the conclusion of this epic count. Collingwood's Nathan Buckley, Adelaide's Mark Rasciuto, and Sydney's Adam Goodes. And forgotten in this historic 3-way tie, Shane Crawford, Gavin Wanganeen and Ben Cousins, all just a vote behind. There had been a 3-way tie in 1930, but that year, Richmond's Stan Judkins won on a countback. In 2003, all 3 leaders would be presented with their medals, toasted by AFL chief Ron Evans and honoured by their peers. For over 30 years, Bobby Skilton has said that he would gladly have traded his 3 Brownlow medals for the chance to be part of one premiership team with his beloved Swans. In a glittering career that would see him win 9 club best and fairests, that trio of Brownlows, legend status in the AFL Hall of Fame, and a spot in the AFL Team of the Century, Skilton could boast only 1 finals appearance. In 1970, under former Melbourne coach Norm Smith, the Swans would finish 4th and play St Kilda in the first semi-final in front of a record 104,000 at the MCG. Skilton would lead his side that day as they played their first final in 25 years, but after leading by 5 points, South Melbourne would fade badly to lose by 9 goals. Bobby Skilton would retire in 1971 after 237 games, a legend of the game who did get a taste of that September action. The quality of Adelaide's performance in winning back-to-back AFL flags in 1997 and 98 can never be underestimated. In 1997, under Malcolm Blight, they won 4 matches in as many weeks to come from 4th to win that history-making flag. 22-year-old Andrew McLeod was the star in both of these premierships. On Grand Final Day 1998, he persevered with an injured knee, but that did little to hinder his blinding pace and brilliance as he gathered 15 kicks and 15 hand passes and, in a little bit of football history, won the Norm Smith Medal for the 2nd successive year. The Roos and Crows both had the wobbles in front of goal. At half-time, Carey's Kangaroos looked to have kicked themselves out of contention with 6-15. In the wash-up, both sides would score 30 times, with the Crows winning by 35 points. Blight's Adelaide became the first expansion team and the first team since Hawthorn in '89 to go back-to-back.
As time goes by, you'll look back, and especially in '98, we travelled for 5 weeks in a row, including the grand final, to win that. And I think that's going to be a long time before a team travels 5 weeks and wins a grand final.
For die-hard Victorian football fans, 1992 was the year the game changed forever. The year the mighty AFL Premiership Cup was transported interstate for the first time. A vanquished grand final challenger in 1991, the West Coast Eagles of Mick Malthouse defeated minor premiers Geelong twice in their 92 finals campaign to underline their right to become the best in the land. On Grand Final Day, 95,000 watched as Peter Sumich and Peter Matera provided by the Eagles skipper John Worsfold. 19-year-old Ashley McIntosh was brilliant on Billy Brownless, while Glenn Jakovich had the tough job of handling Barry Stoneham. Down by 2 goals at half-time, the Eagles, with Norm Smith medalist Matera running rampant, ran away with the game by 28 points. The cup accepted by Worsfold and Malthouse to the joy of every West Australian. With tongue-in-cheek, Brisbane went in search of the Lee-Peat in 2003. 3 in a row under their inspirational coach Lee Matthews. Not since Melbourne in 1957 had a league team twice defended their championship status, and in 2003, after losing to Collingwood in the qualifying final at the MCG 3 weeks earlier, Brisbane's chances looked questionable. This, however, was a mighty combination, fit to stand with the very best in the history of the game.
On the brink of something great, Jason Ackermanis goes to town!
With injuries hampering stars like skipper Michael Voss and Nigel Lappin, it was left to Brownlow medalist Simon Black and Jason Ackermanis to lead the charge. Ackermanis kicked 5, Black gathered 23 hand passes, 39 possessions and the Norm Smith Medal, and with Clark Keating dominating the ruck contests, Brisbane's quest for one of football's greatest challenges was assured. As losing coach Michael Malthouse would say later, "We were beaten by a better side on the day. It's as simple as that, and they are a great side." It's ironic that Tony Lockett's AFL record of 1,360 career goals might well be overshadowed by a kick that went astray. Twice, in 1996, Sydney would come back from seemingly impossible situations to thwart Essendon. It was the preliminary final, however, that would have the most telling consequences. 2 goals down with minutes to play and a grand final berth at stake, the Swans responded to the dire emergency with goals to Dale Lewis and then Darren Creswell. 13 seconds left, scores were tied as they had been on the same ground back in round 6. Wade Chapman found the lead of the injured Lockett.
Lockett, the most important kick of his career. Any score will do. He kicks.
He'd missed the goal, but the most famous point in the club's history was all the Swans needed to move into the grand final for the first time in 51 years.
Yeah, it was great for the club, there's no doubt about that. And I think it was great for footy in New South Wales and great for footy in Sydney. And I think it was probably the mark of where the Swans came of age as an acceptance in the city.
The cowboy Kevin Neal kicked 5 goals in St Kilda's most famous win in a century, yet his goal-kicking efforts in the 1966 premiership win were overshadowed, often consigned to trivia question status. In one of the mighty grand finals, St Kilda and Collingwood were locked in a battle that left 101,000 fans at the MCG nervously strung out until the very end. The Saints under Alan Jeans and the Magpies under Bobby Rose had been inseparable all afternoon. In the lead up to the 1971 Grand Final, the talk had been of Hawthorn's mighty spearhead Peter Hudson and his quest to better Bob Pratt's 37-year-old VFL goal-kicking record of 150 goals in a season. Hudson went into the game against St Kilda on 147 and, having averaged nearly 6.5 goals a game, looked a near certainty to topple one of the game's longest-standing records. He outmarked Bob Murray to post the first inside 2 minutes from 50 metres, and then 7 minutes later was laying dazed and bleeding after being dumped by the Saints' Kevin Neal. His right ear required 8 stitches and his vision was impaired. He snapped a second towards the end of the first quarter, and 23 minutes into the second term equalled the Pratt record, and with 150 goals, his name forever linked with the great Bob Pratt. The bleachers were all but deserted at Waverley back in round 17, 1979, as Fitzroy produced one of the most amazing performances in league history. Just 12,000 witnessed the Lions under coach Bill Stephen embark on a goal-kicking feast that would see them kick the highest score recorded and hand Melbourne the greatest thrashing in VFL history. There was no doubting that Carlton and Richmond were the best sides in the 1972 season, and after a drawn semi-final at Waverley and a Tiger win in the replay, few expected the Blues to be serious challengers on grand final day. Tommy Hafey's Tigers were red-hot favourites, yet by half-time were already out of premiership contention. Carlton's firepower was stunning. In the highest scoring grand final in history, the Blues had kicked 18 goals by half-time, leaving 112,000 at the MCG that day absolutely stunned. John Nichols, in his first year as captain-coach, kicked 6. Alex Jezelenko booted 7, and Robert Walls was reckoned by most as to be best of field with 6 as well. Carlton's 28-9-177, a grand final record, and with the Tigers kicking 22-18, at the time it was the highest scoring match of all time. With skipper Wayne Carey sidelined, few thought the 9th place Kangaroos could trouble ladder leaders and hot premiership favourites Essendon in their round 16 encounter in 2001. 10 minutes into the second quarter, the 51,000 at the MCG that day was stunned as Pagan's men had blown their lead out to 69 points. It was a massacre.
I think we thought we were going to struggle when we were 69 points down, but kick a few goals, get it back to 30 points and see what you can do.
Slowly, the Bombers chipped away at the deficit. A 10-goal second quarter had seen the lead whittled to 21 points. At three-quarter time, the Roos were still up by 14 points, and in the final quarter would relinquish the lead. Sheedy's Bombers had never given up hope. Up forward, Matthew Lloyd kicked 9 goals from 10 kicks. Jason Johnson and James Hird would lift, and Dustin Fletcher became impassable in defence. In the biggest turnaround in league history, Essendon would pile on 8 goals in the last quarter to win by 12 points and maintain their top spot on the ladder.
When you come back from 69 points, it's certainly a memorable game and something that the boys who played will talk about for a long time.
Channel 9 presented the most sensational story of post-war football with a 1-hour special devoted to the shock sacking of Melbourne coaching legend Norm Smith in July 1965. Smith had been embroiled in a bitter legal dispute with umpire Don Blue, and the 6 times premiership coach felt his club committee had not shown unwavering support. When he was critical of the club, he was told his services were no longer required. The ageing Checker Hughes was named as his replacement for the game against North Melbourne at Coburg. That Sunday, in a live television special, Smith talked of his disappointment. He was backed by his most famous protégé in Ron Barassi, and within 4 days, Melbourne had come to its senses and reappointed him to the senior coaching role. But the magic was gone, and Smith's last premiership in 1964 was the last won by the famous club. In a year of massive stories, few shook the football world like the announcement in January 1965 that Melbourne's captain and 6 times premiership star Ron Barassi was moving to Carlton as playing coach. The game's most marketable personality had played 203 games in the famous number 31 jumper, but after much deliberation had decided to embark on a coaching career. His decision shocked the club and left young supporters shattered.
It was the hardest thing in football I ever did, really, to change clubs. In fact, I changed my mind a couple of times, and it was nothing to do with trying to frisk any extra pounds out of Carlton. It was nothing to do with that at all. I rang up and I said, I just can't do this, you know.
Norm Smith had offered to stand down at Melbourne, but Barassi had begun negotiations with Carlton, finally accepting an offer of £18,000 over 3 years. The Carlton offer had been the brainchild of President George Harris, and Australia's highest profile footballer was targeted to help the Blues to their first premiership since 1947. Despite Melbourne's initial opposition, the Demons relented, allowing Barassi to make the move and become the highest paid footballer of any code in the land. In 1968, he coached the Blues to a groundbreaking premiership, ending a 21-year drought. It had become commonplace for footballers to trade loyalties by the beginning of the 80s, but when South Melbourne prepared to move to Sydney, there was public outrage. Beset by financial problems and with a dwindling support base, the Swans were the ideal team to export into the huge Sydney market. In 1982, the Sydney Swans were unveiled at the Opera House. They met Melbourne and recorded their first win at their new home, the SCG. The birth of the Sydney Swans was difficult from the outset as players moved back and forwards from their homes in Melbourne. With their jumper refined to show the outline of the Opera House, but still sporting the famous red and white of South Melbourne, the Swans became the cutting edge of the embryonic national competition. There would be privatisation, financial woes and years of struggle, but the Swans of 1982 became the trendsetters, paving the way for the expansion into Perth and Brisbane and finally Adelaide.